Here with Thomas Lofsky from Cobra, and we're going to talk a little about CG, or center of gravity. I know that's talked a lot about the forums, and we're going to try to get a little bit deep on this. So Tom, when you start designing, let's start with the driver. What are some of the things you're worried about with center of gravity and performance?
Well, one of our goals is always to get the center of gravity pretty much as low as we can for most players. But that said, we have to manage heel, toe, high, low, front, back, all those things. So it's always a trade-off. As you know, everything in design is a trade-off of something else. So CG, materials, face size, body size. It's a pretty iterative CAD process, as you know. Hey, how about this? No, back to the CAD guys, back to the structure guys, back to the sound guys. Doesn't work, try something else. So one of the things we strive for every year is try to make them sound really good, but also get the best performance with CG. And it's just, you know how it goes, just round and round and round. So
one of those trade-offs we always seem to battle is spin versus MOI, right? How do you get it right for that particular player type? So maybe if you're looking for, a player for a tour player, something for Ricky compared to somebody who wants to break 100 for the first time. What are some of the things that you do at Cobra and your team to get that CG just perfect in that regard?
Well, like we have an envelope of player types and things that we know are about right. And sometimes you're trying to push the limit, and sometimes you're trying to hit the middle of the bell curve. So some of those trade-offs are always the questions of, with our marketing team, who's it for? Who do you want to sell it to? How are we going to sell it? Because we can move it around anywhere. And so it's once we get a general target where we think there's a little opportunity in the market or a position or a story, let's go chase that a little bit, and then you go do the testing. So it's just a constant back and forth. One of the things that's interesting, though, to me, and a lot of talk we have on the CG versus MOI debate, because it's a raging one, not only outside the OEMs, but inside. And one of the things we talk about a lot is, MOI in many cases and CG can be related, but sometimes they can't. For instance, I remember in the old days when we made drivers that were shorter front to back and longer heel toe, really high inertia. Well, but CG is a lot forward, so they're not as playable. Good for maybe tour guys, but not so good for amateurs. So it's just trade-off then between CG back and front and CG heel and toe. And, the question again is MOI sometimes is hard to tell because MOI could be our mishits, or MOI could be my front back, and that's a CG function. So with the CG front back function, we know is a critical fitting function. So it's feel, it's shaft, it's everything. So when you start messing around with those, it's always goes back to the player. And when our engineers have a little question, we say, well, let's think about, remember who the player is. We get those players and test with them. But there's a ton going on. And I think it's challenging for golfers, because I think MOI is forgiveness. But if you don't have a square face, what does that mean? You're just going in the woods.
One of the other things, and you know this well, is when we talk about metal woods, because you can move the weight inside or externally. Shape can drive things. You mentioned heel, toe, front to back. So it's not just the internal weight. That's usually the biggest, and hopefully you have enough discretionary mass to move. But the shape can play a big factor. Is this a little taller, shorter? So all of that goes in. Let's shift to irons a little bit. Okay. So when you talk about a 3-iron compared to a wedge, what are some of the things that you and your team are wanting to make sure that it flows right or does for different players? Yeah,
it's really interesting too, Michael, because especially with the success we had in one length, it's really about the flow of the set. Now, not only in variable length, but one length. We've done something this year with the F8 irons where we have a variable hosel length through the set, which is kind of cool. And some of us engineers say, oh, that's been done before, but it is good. It is helpful for a lot of those players. And, when you look at people still buy specialty wedges when they probably shouldn't, specialty wedges are all tall hosels. They still buy set wedges and other things that may not be the best for their game. So we're trying to get the right flow to fit what people want and what people need and try and smooth them into that transition. So we do the same thing with every iron set. And we're doing a lot of studies now, especially with what we learn with one length, both on gapping, both the variable sets and one length sets is, do people have good gaps today with the way we make clubs, with the loft we make clubs, with the CGs we make clubs? Do they have good gaps with one length? All those things are all part of the fun process of the iterative process of irons. And we keep learning more and more about especially one length. One length came to us just over a year ago with Bryson with the launch of F7. And when we started talking to him, we all said, well, hey, one length, it was tried, what happened, how did it work? We spent a bunch of time and we learned from him. And then we learn from ourselves, and sometimes our learnings and his learning weren't quite exactly the same. And it was really good with him because he's a physics major. So it was fun because he's like a member of R&D. So it was always the theory. What's the theory? And Bryce would say, here's my theory, especially because the physics guys are way more theory than practical. So he would have a theory and come in like this, and our guys would say, we don't think so, let's go test it. And when we tested it, and depending on where it went, like if his theory was wrong, as a science person, he said, okay, my theory's wrong, I'm done with that, let's go on to this. A lot of tour players, their theory doesn't change because they still believe it. They don't understand the data and the scientific method. So it was great with him to learn a lot of things. For instance, good example, with one length, he said, I should swing every club the same, right? Because they're all 7-iron length, weight, mass. Everything about them is pretty close. Now, there's a little head moment of inertia shaft matching that's not 100% accurate. But he said, I don't swing them the same. Why is that? His first theory was aerodynamics. There's got to be a different aerodynamic profile of the long iron and the short iron. And Mike Yagley, who's our aerodynamic engineer, worked at Boeing and knows a lot of great stuff. He said, no, looking at these, the frontal area is the same. There's some boundary layer slipping and all these terms that the aero guys use. And we said, no, it's not the case. So we did some more studies and we said, when a golfer looks at a 4-iron or a wedge, what's going on up here? And we know it's different. We know you're looking at different jobs, different tasks. And so you see something that says, oh, Bryson's theory was aero. No, that's not the case. Now he learned because he felt like he was a machine. He said, no, I'm a robot. My swing is a robot. I don't ever change. It can't be that. It's got to be something else. And we learned that, no, you want to do a different thing with that club. The loft that you see is usually what drives your thought process to execute the shot. So
it's such a great story, and not the normal story working with the PGA Tour players, just so everybody's aware of that. I have not worked with Bryson. Tom has. But all the tour players I have, that's not the conversations we typically have. So one last question. We talk about CG and you guys being the expert in one length. I think a lot of people assume that center of gravity is always, or should be always perfectly centered on the face. And that's just not true. Talk to me about when you want to move it around and why and how.
Yeah, certainly a lot of things you do is you're trying to modify face closure, sometimes droop in some cases, especially with one length. We've seen some droop variations from normal. So we're trying to move that around to give best performance because you also know impact locations of many golfers isn't in the center. And one of the things we learned, I'd say this trend, especially with tour irons the last 5-6 years, Ricky was one of the first guys to come in and say, hey, I don't want the CG in the heel, I want it in the center. Because blade clubs forever have had CGs in the heel. So there was a trend the last 3-4 years of moving that CG more in the center for the young players who grew up not used to playing those kind of golf clubs. So we see some of that. We also see with draw bias golf clubs, you want it in the heel. You want that swinging gait to help them close the face. We do see many cases where you're also looking at hybrids and utilities. Do they hit them differently? Do they play them different shots and those things? And we've seen with some baffler technology stuff that sometimes you want the CG more in the heel than you thought because it's really about getting the face square more than it is about the contact point.
So some great stuff from Tom, some great CGs. But I think one thing to remember, and he mentioned, it's not just CG. You can have a perfect CG, but if you don't get the rest of the golf club right, it could still struggle. So CG is critical, but again, not the only thing. And some great stuff from Tom, Bryson DeChambeau, and the whole team at Cobra.